welcome everyone to this first Sunday in Advent. As the snow falls around us, we gather in this season of declining light to bolster each other's spirits and to be people of God representing the light in many ways. A few announcements. We're thankful again to have our lunch pickup process. We are working towards getting us to be able to be back in the building, and that will be wonderful. We've been experimenting, obviously, with some of our funeral celebrations over the last month or so, where we have had gatherings, and so I think that bodes well for those opportunities. Just a reminder, we're coming towards the end of the year, and if you haven't filled out your stewardship commitment form, that would be appreciated in us helping to determine our next year's budget. And we're, as I said, coming into the Advent season, so pay attention. There are going to be a few special events as we move through this season, and we will adapt as the times require, but look forward to inviting people back into the Advent spirit. So invite folks to come back for Advent, and it's great to see all you folks out here. Don has a bit of an update for us.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning. Don Atkinson here as Chair of Finance Committee. I just wanted to give you a brief finance update and an update on our Ramp It Up campaign. The Finance Committee met this last week, and we're optimistically looking forward to a balanced position at the end of the year. So we're not focusing on a deficit reduction campaign. Good news there. Our Ramp It Up campaign, though, is gearing up, and we're hoping that we'll be able to replace the exterior ramp and improve access to the building sometime next year. There's a planning committee being formed by the leadership team, and the good news is that we started off with a government grant of $54,000 towards this project, and we've received a $5,000 Community Foundation of Orillia and area grant, and your generosity has contributed almost another $7,000 towards the campaign. So in total, we're close to $66,000. We're aiming for a total of $100,000 for the work to be completed. So give it some consideration, and if you're able, your contributions between now and the end of the year would be appreciated. And as you know, that helps reduce your tax bill come next April. So if you have any questions about the Ramp It Up campaign and replacing our exterior accessible ramp, I'm happy to answer those after the service. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Don. So pay attention to the newsletter as events unfold, and our life and ministry at St. Paul's continues to do good work in the world. This is our life and ministry time.
We respectfully acknowledge the southern watershed of Manadawat-Sagayagin,
Spirit Lake,
Georgian Bay, and Wayese-Oganing,
Shining Lake,
Simcoe, and centrally, Lake Couchiching waters and land that have historically sustained the lives of Wendat and Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe, and centrally, Rama First Nation, the keepers of the Majinkaning fishing weirs.
These sacred lands and waterways are recognized in the Robinson-Huron Treaty, Williams Treaties, and J. Collins Land Purchase, recognizing all nations gathered and living here today from across Turtle Island, including the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
sorrows, God in our hunger, suffering with us, taking our part. Still you empower us, mothering Spirit, feeding, sustaining from your own heart. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change. Those without status, those who are nothing, you have made royal, gifted with rights, chosen as partners, midwives of justice, birthing new rhythms, lighting new lights. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change. Not by your finger, not by your anger, will our world order change in a day, but by your people, fearless and faithful, small paper lanterns lighting the way. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change. Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful, you do not change.
Those who dwell in darkness have seen a great light. These are the words of the prophet Isaiah for those who were feeling oppressed back about 3,000 years ago as they anticipated life in Babylon in their captivity there. These words continue to speak to us in this Advent time as we are surrounded by the darkness, both literally and metaphorically, and we imagine the coming of the light, the Christ light. The Advent season is one of anticipating the light. So we light the Christ candle in that anticipation. We also light our candle of solidarity for those who dwell in darkness in these times and need our encouragement. So too, we light this candle of the reconciliation journey. You remember about 2 months ago, we had that special service where we as a congregation invited the Indigenous artists into the Call 83 project, the art project, into Around 3. And part of our pledge as this congregation was to walk with the artists as they did their work. Remember, they do a 2-week cycle, an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous, first an Indigenous and then a non-Indigenous and so on. And this carries on throughout the year. So we have, with me being away and neglectful of the process, it has already begun. Albert Snatch began on October the 18th, and then Jeanette Luchette on November the 3rd. And on November the 18th, Mercedes Sandy began the process. So she is now in process of creating her artwork to be part of the reconciliation journey that we are offering our good spirit and our holding of her as an artist during this time. So we will continue to light this candle throughout this year and till August of next year as we celebrate and hold the artists in their work. So too, as part of our Advent tradition, we light these Advent candles. As we enter this season of Advent, we do so in the darkness of these days. As the light dwindles, we acknowledge what it means to live in dark times, to be conscious of the fears, challenges, and uncertainties of these times. We gather, so is it, I guess it, we didn't get this up on the PowerPoint. So I'm inviting you to respond. We gather together to face the darkness. We gather together to face the darkness. While the dark can bring uncertainty, it can also bring rest. It can allow us to stop and reflect on the gifts of life, which have both darkness and light. We gather together to reflect on the gifts of darkness and light. So we'll get this down by next week. It's okay. So in this first week of Advent, we light the candle of hope. Hope enables us to live in the darkness and to yearn for the light. It is a divine gift that never burns out. May we live in hope. Of Advent, as we understand what it means to live in darkness in the literal sense, but also in the symbolic and metaphorical sense of what it surrounds us. That one of the themes of darkness is our mental health in these times that are challenging to many of us. It's a concern. And so I asked Don about a good reference point of someone knowledgeable about mental health issues in Orillia, and he pointed to Brian Adams, who has been a long-term clinical social worker, sociologist, working with the Mental Health Association here in Orillia. He did his education in Toronto, but then came here in '77 to be part of a response to the Mental Health Association and challenges here. So I really appreciate Brian taking the time to come and be with us this morning and offering us some reflections.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I really do count it a privilege to have been asked to speak for a couple of minutes this morning. The problem was in the request to speak only for a couple of minutes. And as some of you probably well know, I can't even answer a question in a couple of minutes. But I do have a couple of things that I want to sort of pass along in the hope that it will be helpful to you. I cannot help but think about the whole theme of today's service, which I wasn't really aware of when I was preparing some of my comments, because the last comment I wanted to make today is probably the one I'm going to lead off with, and that is the sense of hope that I feel is so diminished in the lives of the people who struggle with a multitude of mental health and addiction-related problems. If I had to sort of say it in a few words, what is the primary theme that I've observed with people struggling with mental illness, mental health problems over the years? It's the loss of hope that somehow something will get better in their lives. The sense of optimism has been lost because of a plethora of problems. And I think our collective resolve as a community, and as a faith community in particular, is to reach out, continue to reach out and respond, to try to instill some level of hope in those who feel that it has been lost and it's depleted. So that's so the theme of today's service is consistent with what I'm hoping to impart. And by the way, these last couple of comments aren't included in the 10 minutes I was asked to speak. So when we don't have to step outside of the community of Orillia to see increasing problems with poverty, homelessness, stressors related to work and school, and the catastrophe that so many people have experienced over the last year and a half with the increasing isolation and withdrawal and distancing from those people and places and things that were so important to them. Certainly the increasing focus and concentration on the need for mental health services just dramatizes that. The increasing problem within this community of the opioid crisis, and I could go on with a number of other what we call societal problems, psychosocial problems, but it's this accumulation of things that has left us all bewildered and wondering about sort of where it's going and where it's ending. And it is not unusual that any one of us, in response to these increasing levels of pressure and stress, may feel a bit consumed and overwhelmed at any one time. So that's one of the first things I also want to convey. There is a normalcy in sometimes the way we feel about this onset of problems over which we feel we have no control. And again, if I had to look at the kinds of things that create stress in your life and mine and the multitudes of folks in this community, it's when we don't feel we have any control or sense of control or mastery over the things that we're being challenged and confronted with. And hopefully that makes sense as you hear that. That's usually what is stressful to us is when we're involved in something that's gone south and we don't feel we have any sense of control over it. That's what I think is the cornerstone of a lot of stress. So what I want to kind of emphasize is there is a normalcy to some of the difficulties that ensue or follow from that kind of turbulence. Things like changes in the way we think, changes in the way we feel, our moods, changes in the way we perceive the world around us. And those are cornerstones in what I consider to be the definition, if I can even use that word, of what we mean when we talk about mental health problems. It's really, as some of you I think have heard me say this before, it's primarily, in its most simplest way of looking at it, a disturbance in the way we think, the way we feel, or the way we perceive the world around us. So when I talk about a disturbance in thinking, it's our cognitive processes, the way we process information, the way we speak, the way we think about some of the things that are happening to us. Sometimes the helpful, adaptive ways of thinking, and as you can appreciate, oftentimes the more maladaptive ways of thinking, particularly when people are facing a lot of pressure. When I talk about a disturbance in the way we feel, I'm essentially talking about our moods, the way we feel on any given day. And then thirdly, when I use the expression a disturbance in the way we perceive the world around us, it's how we interpret some of the events that are going on in our life. And so if I use an extreme example of someone who's experiencing a level of psychosis, which we know is a profoundly disturbing and debilitating mental illness, that's the domain of the problem. Their perception of the world around them becomes quite skewed. So in just thinking about this for a minute, I want to stress that there is a normalcy sometimes to shifts in all of those patterns when any one of us feel a bit consumed by pressure. So the question then becomes, when does the way we feel or the way we think or the way we're perceiving things around us become problematic? When do we begin to think about a more significant mental health problem and begin to use the language of a psychiatric disorder? And again, not to oversimplify it, but to kind of provide some clarity. It's when those disturbances or those problems in the way we think, feel, or perceive the world around us start to become more persistent. And they begin to persist over time. So there's a chronicity to the problem. So those momentary or daily or situational times where you feel absolutely overwhelmed, saddened, anxious, despondent, hopeless, starts to persist over time, and it becomes a much more profound and much more enduring kind of difficulty. Secondly, when the way we think, feel, or perceive the world around us starts to impede and impair our level of functioning, which is one of the markers when we start talking about psychiatric problems or a psychiatric disorder. There is a defined impairment in some of the ways we function. And it could be such things as thinking, feeling. It could be things like appetite, sleep, energy level. And all I would have to do here is poll all of you, which I wouldn't do publicly. And I would not be surprised to learn that any one of us in the room, when we're overwhelmed with some kind of a situational problem, often will have problems with things like sleep, appetite, energy level. So these, what we call vegetative signs, are one of the first markers as well. Some of the behavioral changes that we see, things like sadness, withdrawal, increasing distance, which we sometimes see with people with bona fide mental health problems, increased use of alcohol or drugs to help cope and numb and mask some of the discomfort, other more compulsive kinds of problems, irritability. When I talk about problems with mood, though we often think about anxiety and depression and what now is referred to as bipolar mood disorder as examples, so too, increasingly, some folks become more irritable. I saw that a lot with younger people primarily, who had no idea what was going on with the way they were thinking and feeling, other than the fact that it was extremely uncomfortable for them. Very distant and very traumatizing, that they couldn't understand it. And in response to that, there would be increased irritability, argumentativeness, belligerence. And so when I look at how all of this manifests, I put all of that into the same package. I know that I'm going quickly because I want to try to convey a couple of things in this short window. So the marker to me is when these kinds of difficulties persist over time, we start to look at a more significant problem. On a situational basis or even a recurrent basis, there is a certain level of normalcy. I spent exhaustive amounts of time, when I think of the folks that I had the privilege of treating over the years, trying to normalize some of the experiences they were having, particularly when they couldn't articulate what was going on, other than the fact that they didn't like the kind of thoughts they had, or the recurrent intrusive thoughts that were really, really unsettling to them, or the fluctuations in their mood, the turbulence that they were feeling in a lot of their emotional life, just trying to sort of normalize it, but without being desensitive or insensitive to it, and without certainly demeaning or dismissing the importance and the intensity of what people were telling me was their experience. But sometimes knowing that in a certain situation, your response isn't unusual. And I would often use words like, sometimes in a situation such like that, it wouldn't be unusual or it's not abnormal to be feeling that way. That in itself, if you go back to my first comment, also can instill some hope in a person who feels so bewildered and so traumatized by the way they're feeling that they think something is much more significantly wrong. At the same time, to go to the other side, I'm also sensitive to the fact that in our community, we have a lot of people struggling with major psychiatric disorders. And I might just mention as an aside, one of the things about this community, which you may or may not know, is Orillia was one of the first communities in the province of Ontario that got funding for a community mental health program. And that was largely through the work at the time of Dr. Alistair Finnison, who I think was a member of this assembly for a long time, and Bill Hume, who is the executive director of the hospital, put together a proposal because the Ministry of Health was looking at funding more community-based services that were more directly accessible to the people that wanted them without having to go through a third-party referral. And Orillia was one of the first programs funded. I came to Orillia in '77 to help start that program. It's now soon 2022. I haven't left. And though retired, I'm still very, very involved in trying to look at the development of services that really meet primarily the needs of people who are suffering. Because as I'm sure we can all appreciate, there are many individuals who languish in the privacy of their home, motel room, rooming house, wherever, and are not comfortable enough to reach out for help. And that's one of the tragedies, by the way, of mental illness. It stops people sometimes from reaching out because of the stigma that surrounds the nature of the illness and so on. But I have to keep checking myself here because of the time, so I can't go on with that. When we look at how do we treat this, how do we deal with this? Well, one of the things that we cannot separate from mental health problems in Orillia is the increasing reliance on alcohol and drugs to help mask some of that discomfort. Now, I'm not suggesting in that comment that every time we look around us on the street and see people that are heavily addicted to either drugs or alcohol, that there's an underlying or significant mental health problem. But the relationship between those two has been very, very well established. Historically, mental health concerns and addiction concerns were treated in two different silos. And the Ministry of Health made a decision years ago, quite rightfully and justifiably, you can't separate the two. There are many people who suffer with mental health problems who, in an attempt to minimize some of the discomfort, might overuse alcohol or drugs just to help numb some of that discomfort. The problem with addiction, of course, is the very substance that many people use to help alleviate the discomfort and the suffering. In turn, it can intensify it. And so if at another occasion I have an opportunity to come back and discuss some of this, we can talk more about that relationship. But when I walk the main streets of Orillia as you do, and I know many of the folks there that are suffering, it is very easy to become judgmental and make decisions about why do people persist with this kind of psychopathology, this kind of a problem. But therein lies the malaise of mental health related problems. My last comment, because first of all, I want to have some credibility that I stayed within the narrow time frame I was given, is to go back to the first comment that I made. The most profound, agonizing suffering that I see people in our community experience is when they don't feel they have a sense of hope, that somehow things will be better in their life. And as you heard me say a few minutes ago, the sense of optimism has been diminished. The light has gone out. And if I could suggest anything, as I said a minute ago, as a community of concerned individuals, as a faith community in particular, we have some responsibility to those that are suffering to help change that. And I don't mean to minimize it or suggest that it's something that happens quickly overnight, but our collective resolve is to somehow try to establish some level of hope in the people who feel they've lost it. And when I think again of the multitudes who I felt privileged to meet and help through some of that suffering, it was to try to offer something in the way of hope that gave the person a feeling at the end of that day that that day was ending on a little bit of a better note than it started. Now those are minuscule changes, but that's what I invite us to think about as I close off my comments, that our collective resolve and responsibility is to help instill hope in the lives of those who have lost it. And I'm the eternal optimist because I actually believe that can happen. I know it can happen, and because I know many of you that I'm looking right now, even behind the masks, I know you're already doing that. So thank you for this opportunity to give a brief comment, and I hope that it also is consistent and sets the stage for the Advent services ahead, and certainly today with the theme of hope. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, sorry to oppress you with that strict timeline, Brian, but you managed within that time frame to convey the core of the issue, both the challenge, but also on this Sunday, the opportunity of hope as lightening all of our hearts and moving us in that direction. So I know our response, and maybe Gloria, we could organize a community gathering and give Brian a little more expansive time to talk further about this. So thank you again, Brian. Let's continue by singing or humming very quietly, "Hope is a Star." Please stand to participate in this.
First, and the weak shall be strong, and
We acknowledge the generosity of this community as we come together in our work, in our care, in our prayers for each other, and also in our financial commitments to lift the spirit of light in this dark time. So we give thanks for these gifts that are offered in so many ways. Let us come into a time of prayer as we come together as a community. Spirit of light, you burn through the darkness of these dwindling days. When the darkness surrounds us in the waning days of this season, a season that is full of challenges, of busyness or lack of busyness. Challenges that imagine a different world, challenges that invite us to offer solidarity with all those who are suffering these days. So in the dark surrounds, we offer our prayers of concern for those in our community who suffer from mental challenges, from physical challenges, from the challenges of getting through each day. We extend our prayers to those facing persecution, for migrants challenged by physical and barriers that prohibit them from seeking the life that they desire. For those facing disease, for the pandemic that continues to challenge us in different ways around the world. For those facing the challenges of natural disaster caused by climate change and the realities of our changing planet. On we go in the list of challenges that surround us. Yet in this midst we feel your sense of light and presence that continues to burn in the small corners of our minds and our hearts as we continue to pray and to hold each other with hope and with caring and with compassion. So we give thanks for this gift of life and the opportunity to be a presence of hope to each other. May this spirit of goodness be amongst this community and spread to the world around. Amen.
Soft as the voice of an angel, breathing a lesson unheard. Hope with a gentle persuasion whispers her comforting word. Wait till the darkness is over. Wait till the tempest is done. Hope for the sunshine tomorrow. dusk of the twilight, dim be the region afar. Will not the deepening darkness brighten the glimmering star? Then, when the night is upon us, why should the heart sink away? When the dark midnight is over, watch for the breaking of day. Whispering, 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 oh, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in its sorrow rejoice. Whispering, 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 oh, how welcome thy voice, oh, welcome thy voice, making my heart in its sorrow rejoice.
Luke writes in chapter 21, verses 25 to 36, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." Then Jesus told them a parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day catch you unexpectedly like a trap. for it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Here ends the reading. Thanks be to God.
The other day I was finishing up some meetings around 4:30, and I thought I would grab a little time to go for a run with Nellie. And so quickly got into my running clothes, and we jumped in the car, and we like to run through Scouts, up the Scouts forest. And so drove over there quickly and headed off through the woods. And as we proceeded up over the hills and down into the valley, we recognized that arriving there at 4:45 and then running around 5 o'clock, that by the middle of the run I was almost bumping into the trees, that the darkness had begun to set in quite rapidly. Having already wrecked my hand, having fallen in the dark running a few weeks ago, I didn't want to do that again. Anyway, we proceeded through the forests and survived our run. But as I worked my way back up the hill and back over towards the parking lot, the gloom set in of the darkness surrounding us at 5 o'clock, as I imagined, it's too early to go to bed. What would I do? But the darkness is all around, and that season of this time weighs heavy on me, and I know a number of us feel this seasonal decline as we live into the dark. And so it seemed then the theme of Isaiah's reflections on those who dwell in darkness have seen the light. So how do we live into the darkness? How do we live into the darkness of this time and find some light, find some hope in response? Well, that biblical passage that Donnajean read doesn't provide a lot of hope, does it? It's an apocalyptic reading. Luke, the lectionary writers, chose this passage from the end of Jesus' ministry towards his time of going to Jerusalem. And so the language is anticipating what's going to happen in Jerusalem, and so it is filled with this kind of apocalyptic warning and dread that there will be signs, the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth distress amongst the nations, confused by the roaring of the seas and the waves. So it anticipates that there will be turmoil and that uncertain times. So I think what we understand as we try to decipher the meaning of this text written a few thousand years ago, written in a context that both anticipated out of the Jewish canon, the people exiled to Babylon and their feeling in exile, but also the temple. Luke is writing after the destruction of the temple, when the Romans found the Jews disruptive and came and destroyed the temple and killed many, many thousands of them. And so it was a time of apocalyptic angst about will the world end, and how will we understand that reality as people of faith? How do we understand that? So it's teaching us to pay attention to the context. How do we address the realities around us, the world? And the passage is talking about being attentive to the things that are around us. But its core message is, even in uncertain times, God is with us. Creator is there, connecting to us and offering us a spirit of hope, even in these challenging times. So indeed, it doesn't take much to imagine that these are challenging times, does it? As we read the paper and we see yet another alarm coming out of Africa, out of South Africa, of a new coronavirus with more spikes and more opportunities for infection. And I think all of us groan at the thought of further pandemic realities. And can we not cycle out of this challenging time? And then the realities of weather and seeing what's been happening on the East Coast and out west in British Columbia. I happened to arrive in British Columbia as this rains came down 2 weeks ago now, and so got to witness firsthand that reality. In the summertime, I told you about having arrived under the heat dome and the burning fires, and then I arrive to experience the flooded realities. So maybe don't let the people of BC know the next time I'm traveling out there. I hope I'm not But it was an incredible experience. I was out running in the deluge of that rain, and it was pounding. And fortunately, we were up in Salmon Arm, which is up the valley and away from the flooding down in the lower mainlands. But a number of our people, ministers that were coming to the conference, got caught down in the lower mainland, and some made it through, dodging rocks on the Sunday, and made it through, but then were locked up in Salmon Arm and had challenges about how to get back down. So the reality of this changing climate is pressing in on us. And we see the urgency of our need to respond, and we see the events of the COP meetings in Glasgow, and we see disappointing results, at least to me, in how the political leadership is unable, for a variety of reasons, to step up, to have good words, but not as much concrete action as we would desire. And so we see that challenge and that reality. Andrew Coyne, in his column yesterday, talked about how a carbon tax would, if implemented, would solve a lot of the challenges for Canadians. If we were able to ramp it up, it would change the economic and cultural realities by having all of us and businesses having to pay more and offsetting that. The challenge, so we get presented with this factual reality, and we know there's all kinds of technological solutions to this challenge, but the reality is, if you're a political leader, to impose a huge carbon tax would be political suicide. And so we're betwixt and between these realities. We recognize, on the one hand, vaccinations work, and the factual reality from the medical community and the reality of a complex of people's responses. We recognize on climate change the solutions, the facts, the scientific understanding, the opportunity to respond in concrete ways, and yet on the other side, the challenge of changing political culture and changing us. Canada ranks amongst the worst in the world in terms of per capita carbon expenditure. We continue to, through our ways of life, expend some of the most carbon in the world. So we have these disconnects between it. So it brings us back to this kind of psychological challenge of understanding dark and light, what it means to live in midst the apocalyptic times, the dark times, the challenges. And we recognize the psychology of that when we're feeling anxious, it's hard to do anything. When we're feeling the darkness of grief or despair or of uncertainty, it's hard to respond and move. And so we live amidst the realities of living in the dark and seeking the light. So as I imagined coming into this Advent time, and as I seek to get through these waning days until the light changes at winter solstice, what can we do to live in the darkness with a different response? Well, as typically Richard Wagami spoke to me, his words about taking each day and recognizing the sacredness of it, that life is a gift each day and it's a sacred journey. How do we see the darkness as a sacred gift? How do we respond into that darkness? We recognize the natural world is going to sleep. It's a time of change. And even though outwardly things are shutting down, we recognize under the ground the trees continue to communicate and pass energy. The plants are resting, getting ready for spring, that it's a time of working our way down. The ancient peoples gathered around fires at this time to bolster themselves against the dark, to reflect on the journey of this year, to reflect as a community of faith how we hold each other in these dark times. I see the hospitality of this community as we have stepped up and offered comfort and hospitality of food as we celebrated a number of people's lives in the last few weeks. The hospitality as I gathered a group of ministers here, and they appreciated how much the hospitality of this community and the hospitality of our response towards the Indigenous community with our reconciliation gallery, how we respond by taking poinsettias out into the community. And so as you begin to look around, you see amidst the darkness that there are signs of light and that we can hold each other in ways that take us to a different way of seeing this time as being a time of rest, of reflection, of yearning towards that light. This is the core, I think, of what this gospel message is about, that even during apocalyptic times and dark times, the message of God's goodness burns bright, and that we can be held and secure and comfort in that. May that be so. Amen. To again stand and I was interested. I've been, as I said, meeting with different groups of ministers over the last couple of weeks, both out west and here, and a number of them commented that they had a hard time containing their congregants from singing behind their masks. So I'm not encouraging you to sing behind your mask, but if it happens a bit and you don't, I could imagine that that might not be a bad thing. So.
Go with us every day, filling all our lives with love and joy and peace. May the God of justice lead us on our way, bringing light and hope to every land and race. Praying, let us work for peace, singing, share our joy with all, working for a world that's new, faithful. Treasured and pursued. May the God of love keep our commitment clear to a world restored, to human life renewed. Praying, let us work for peace, singing, share our joy with all, working for a world that's new, faithful when we hear God's call.
So we walk as people who walk amidst the darkness, these challenging times. But we are people of hope and caring and compassion. And we know Creator offers us that hope, offers us that connection. And may we walk with friend Jesus through the challenges and opportunities of life, and the Spirit of love surround each and every one of you. May that be so. Amen.
Oh, shines as the solitary star, faith is the